The Environmental Protection Agency has some work to do to make its back to the office plans more clear. The agency's Office of Inspector General finds there are a lot of policies that might confuse employees. Katherine Trimble is the Assistant Inspector General for Audits at the Environmental Protection Agency's Inspector General's office. Katherine, welcome. Thanks very much for coming on the program. What did you look at and where in examining the EPA's reopening plans?
Sure. Before I tell you exactly what we looked at, let me provide a little bit of background. So starting last spring, the federal government, including the CDC, issued a series of pieces of guidance for federal agencies to consider as they plan to bring their federal employees back into the workplace. So as part of this guidance, it included a phased approach, phases 1 through 3, with phase 1 being the most restrictive and phase 3 being essentially a return to operations as they were prior to the pandemic, albeit with certain health and safety measures in place. So based from there, EPA developed its own location-specific plans across the agency for how they would bring their employees back in. And we looked at 13 of those location-specific plans at the EPA for phases 1 and 2. And those 13 locations that we looked at really incorporated where the bulk of EPA staff work.
What did you find as you looked at those plans for those various locations? I imagine that there were differences among them. Were the differences based on the locations and the conditions in those locations? Were they based on the decisions that EPA leaders made in those various locations? What did you find overall?
Yeah, so what we found is that, the location-specific plans did incorporate, the elements of the CDC and other government guidance. However, we found differences by location as to how some of those health and safety measures were addressed. So some of these health and safety measures include, say, face coverings or social distancing or public transportation. And we just thought that warranted a closer look.
And those are some of the most important elements of the CDC's recommendations, not just for government employees, but for everybody across the country. And I imagine that's what prompted you and your team to write, the EPA should ensure such differences do not place employees at an increased risk of contracting or spreading COVID-19 merely as a result of their work location. What should the EPA do? What are you recommending for the EPA to make these plans more consistent across the various locations?
Yeah, no, thanks, Francis. So what we recommended is that EPA, as it starts to consider moving into phase 3 and refining its phase 3 reopening plans, that it take another look and see, are we adhering to the guidance, first and foremost, and then, do these differences we have make sense? So in some cases they might. I brought up the issue of public transportation. So at an EPA location where maybe there's not a public transportation infrastructure where employees largely drive their personal vehicles into the office, it would make sense that a plan for that location isn't super focused on public transportation. But, what we want is, again, take a look when it comes to other health and safety measures, make sure that the differences you have by location make sense and, as we said, aren't placing employees at risk.
Katherine, the government executive article about your work reports at the time that you did this work, based on EPA status of August 7th, 2 facilities in phase 0, 8 in phase 1, 2 in phase 2, 1 closed. Did you look at the criteria that the locations or that the EPA more broadly made for moving from one phase to another, or was the scope of your work just on how they were deciding what advice to give their employees?
Yeah, that's right. So what you're talking about is referred to as gating criteria, how you make the decision to move from phase to phase. And we did not. If folks want to look, our report does contain some information about that gating criteria, but that's not something we assessed in particular. We were focused on the plans and then the differences between the plans related to those health and safety measures.
What's the takeaway from your work, Katherine, that somebody at another agency, whether in an inspector general's office or a decision maker, what's the takeaway that that person might have for how that person should think about what we're telling employees about coming back to the office?
Sure. So I think, obviously, and, I know the federal agencies know this, but, there is the guidance out there, that guidance I was talking about from last spring, from CDC and others to consider. And then really to look where, if there are, based on your different locations, if you do have differences in how you're going to bring employees back in and what those employees can expect in terms of health and safety measures, just make sure that, that there are reasons for that, and it'll be clear to employees as to what to expect, and again, to help ensure that they will be safe.
We have about a minute left, Katherine. I mentioned that this work was based at the beginning of August. Is this an issue that you're going to continue paying attention to, and might you look at other locations throughout the chain at EPA?
So what we're planning to do is, as part of our follow-up to all the work we do at EPA OIG, we always have, a discussion with the agency as they prepare their responses to our recommendations. And we'll kind of continue a dialogue as to whether those plans address the intent of our recommendations. So that'll be ongoing. But in addition, we do plan to look at EPA's Phase 3 reopening plans as they are issued, as EPA brings its offices into, Phase 3. And then we'll determine at that point whether we think additional work is necessary.
Katherine Trimble, thanks very much for joining me. I appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me, Francis.